Hi, I'm Tony Holtz from Axiom Compliance Learning, and this video is a resource for anybody who's inspecting and testing fire extinguishers and fire blankets. Before we start in inspection fire extinguishers, we've got to understand that there is more to it than just applying an inspection checklist to a fire extinguisher. We have to understand the legal framework involved in inspecting and testing, and all the governing factors around the fire environment and why a fire extinguisher is used and in a building in the first place. So let's start at the top, the legal framework. The legal framework is based on the Environmental Planning and Protection Act, and that puts into place a requirement for buildings to have fire safety measures in order to cover the fire risk of a building. So fire extinguishers form part of that fire safety protection system of a building, and it's a first attack mechanism. So the fire risk associated with any given area needs to be assessed before a fire extinguisher is put in place. And all that's done before you come along to inspect the fire extinguisher. So it's important that we understand that fire risk and we understand that the correct fire extinguisher is in the correct place, because people change them, they move them, they build walls and they place things in different positions, and the fire risk of buildings over a period of time can change from the original design. So we're going to talk a little bit about fire risk and a little bit about some of the information that you need in order to do this job correctly. So from the Environmental Planning and Protection Regulation, it refers to the building code, and the building code forms a list of fire safety measures to cover the fire risk in any given building. And as I said, fire extinguishers is just one measure, which is the first attack measure. And the idea of a fire extinguisher is that if a fire breaks out, we should be able to contain that fire or put it out before the building catches a hold. So in addition to the requirement of the fire extinguisher, it's also got to be the right fire extinguisher for the risk that presents itself. Now, there's another Australian standard, so one level down from the building code. So I would encourage you to download the building code. It's a free document. If you Google ABCB, you'll come up with the ABCB website, and you can download a free copy of the building code. And in addition to the checklist, there are also other requirements for certain types of fire extinguishers in certain buildings. So there's a different requirement in buildings where people sleep to buildings where people just gather and congregate and work. It's important that you understand those differences, and those differences can be found in E1.6 of the building code, which deals directly with fire extinguishers within different building classes or different building types. So down one level from that, you come to the Australian standards. So the Australian standard called AS2444, Selection and Location of Fire Extinguishers, talks about fire risk. And the risk of fire is from a Class A fire to a Class F fire. So during your training, you'll learn what Class A fire, Class B fire, C, D, E and F fires are, and you'll be able to identify the risk of that particular type of fire in a given building. So we have to make sure that the fire extinguisher somebody picks up for their first attack on a fire is not dangerous. So for example, if you've got the risk of a fat fire and you're in a kitchen and you have the risk of the big vat of fat catching on fire, to use a CO2 fire extinguisher in that environment is downright dangerous for the person using the extinguisher. So it's really important that you understand this fire risk before you undertake fire inspection. The other thing that the AS2444 talks about is the risk profile in buildings. So the risk of a fire getting big quickly. So you have light risk, you have ordinary risk, and you have high risk of fire. We need to understand what risk level a building has in general in order to select the right size fire extinguisher. In addition to that, we need to understand the travel distance between fire extinguishers. So all of this becomes a part of a fire survey, and we'll do that fire survey within the course, and it'll be a part of your assessment requirements. So just inspecting the fire extinguisher, like we're going to show you in the video, is not all there is to it. Understand what the requirements are before you undertake this work. Enjoy the video. Thank you. Routine inspection and maintenance of fire extinguishers starts when you approach a fire extinguisher and look in the general area that the fire extinguisher is meant to cover. The fire extinguisher should be mounted so that the user can easily see the instructions on how to use the fire extinguisher and the pictographs which indicate the fires that it's safe to be used for. In this case, a liquid fuel fire and an electrical fire. It also should be clearly marked the type of fire extinguisher, in this case a 3.5 kilo carbon dioxide, and the black band indicating a CO2 fire extinguisher. A CO2 type of fire extinguisher in general is a fire extinguisher that covers the risk of fire in electrical equipment. So we should be mindful of the area that the fire extinguisher exists to cover the type of risk that may exist in that area. So in this area we've got carpet, we've got wood, we've got linings of walls, which would represent an A risk or an A-class risk, a carbonous solids. And I can see that there's a server room in here. We've got lots of expensive electrical equipment in this room, a photocopier, a server, and communication equipment. And I would say that this extinguisher is primarily to cover that electrical risk. So as we're approaching the extinguisher, we should be seeing signage, and the signage needs to be, a location sign needs to be a minimum of 2 metres high and visible from 20 metres. It can be higher than 2 metres if it's required. If it's any lower than 2 metres, that's not so much of a problem as long as the fire extinguisher, as long as it can be seen from 20 metres. We can also see what we call in the industry a type sign. Now this type sign explains that the CO2 fire extinguisher should exist in this location, and it's not necessary to have the type sign in accordance with the checklist. However, it's a good idea to include the type sign as you're installing a fire extinguisher, so that if the fire extinguisher isn't there as we inspect it, we know what type should have been there. It's important that the fire extinguisher is mounted a minimum of 100 millimetres off the ground and a maximum of 1.2 metres off the ground. The extinguisher should be easily removed so that anybody, even a child, could remove it off the bracket, and the bracket should be fixed to a permanent building structure, and this one's nice and tight, and all of that passes the inspection checklist. Okay, so we'll remove the fire extinguisher and take it to a more comfortable position for inspection. Okay, so we have our fire extinguisher in a more comfortable position, and let's complete our inspection. First place to start is the manufacture date or the last pressure test date of the fire extinguisher. So we're doing a level 2 inspection, which is a 12-monthly inspection. So we have 3 types of inspections on fire extinguishers: a level 1, which is 6-monthly, a level 2, which is yearly, and a level 4, which is 5-yearly. So every fire extinguisher is subject to a pressure test or a level 4 inspection and test every 5 years. So we need to find out where our starting point is. Now, there is a manufacture date on the fire extinguisher and stamped indelibly on all fire extinguishers. So this fire extinguisher has a manufacture date of the 6th month 2010. So I'm looking for another indelible mark in 2015. And it should be stamped by the pressure testing station. And I can see another mark here, which is the 1st month 2011, which is a bit strange because that's a year after the manufacture date. I can't see any other marking that indicates it's been pressure tested recently. So the fire extinguisher fails the inspection at this point. Now, I would remove this for pressure testing and replace it with a loaner, and I would put an out of service tag on the fire extinguisher so I can track where it is and for the standard purposes. Now, I'm going to continue the inspection because that may determine whether I spend the money pressure testing it or whether I condemn the fire extinguisher and replace it. So I'm going to continue on with the inspection. And we've looked at the signage and we've looked at the location of the fire extinguisher and the brackets and so forth. We had a quick look at the label, and the label is in quite good condition. We also need to look at the label from a servicing perspective, and I'll just remove this. And here's the information that's relevant to us. We know the class of fire, BE, and we know the rating of the class by looking at the label. We're also looking for the weight of the fire extinguisher which is not on this part of the label, but it's usually found here. So this information here is for the service person, not for the user. Okay, so we'll continue on. We've got to make sure that the canister is in good condition. So we normally, in the process of giving it a bit of a wipe down, inspect the canister and make sure that we've got no rust or damage, in particular dints, and make sure you look at the whole extinguisher and just ensure that you have no damage that's going to cause any problems with the pressure. We have stored pressure inside here. It's at quite high pressure, so we want to make sure the canister is in good condition. If you have any rust marks that are starting to pit the metal, you should either treat those or take the extinguisher out of service. I'm not a fan of dints. I can't tell what the damage is on the inside of the canister, so I'll more often than not condemn a fire extinguisher if it has dints. This one looks okay, so we'll continue on to the hose. Now we must make sure that the hose is the correct type for the fire extinguisher, and this comes from experience, or you can check with the manufacturer. Google's a good thing for that. But we're looking at the external condition of the hose. This one looks pretty good. But the standard also requires that we ensure that the hose is not blocked. And we must make sure it's not blocked in one of two ways, either a passage of air through or a probe being pushed up into it. So in this case, we have an expandable nozzle, so I can't push anything up into it. So I'm going to remove the hose and put a passage of air through it to make sure it's not blocked. Now, it's a little bit tight, so I'm going to need to use my shifter to remove it. I'll just loosen it up with that. So it's as simple as just, it's clear. While we've got the hose off, it's a good opportunity to look in to the actuating device and make sure that all parts inside the head are clear as well. So this is a nice dark spot for insects and vermin to come up and build their nests. And we can also check for residue of any of the contents. If the fire extinguisher is leaking through the actuating device, you'll see a bit of residue, which is another indicator that it could be leaking. That looks quite clear and looks quite good. So we'll put the hose back on and move on to, I think we'll weigh the fire extinguisher next. Just give that a nip up. So we have labelling on the fire extinguisher that tells us what the label weight is. Okay, so this extinguisher has a tare weight of 4.16 kilo and then a gross weight of 4.77 kilo. And if we add those two weights together, we get the total weight. And it comes up to about 8.9 kilos. So I've got to use a scale. By the standards, this scale should be accurate to within 1% of the fire extinguisher weight. We use a calibrated scale, and every 6 months we check the calibration of the scale, just on a known weight. So I'm looking for 8.9 kilos. Waiting for it to turn red for me. There we go. Ooh. Okay, so the weight recorded is 8.8 kilos, which is 100 grams below what the label weight says. Now, does it pass or fail? I use a tolerance of 5%. They never weigh, or rarely weigh, what they're supposed to weigh. The standard doesn't tell us what our tolerance can be, so I use 5%. It's generally acceptable that somebody can be within plus or minus 5%. And remember, it can be overcharged as well. And in particular with CO2 fire extinguishers, it's a problem if they're overcharged because CO2 expands under temperature. And when the extinguisher reaches a certain temperature, the pressure gets way too much for the head to be able to withstand it. So it's important that we not only weigh the fire extinguisher, but record the weight as well. So I'm going to pass that. That's within 5% of the weight. And as I said, it's really important to record that. So I'll record that weight on my database for comparison purposes later on. Okay, so I'm now going to look at the fire extinguisher anti-tamper seal. We've got to make sure the anti-tamper seal is placed in a way that you have to break the seal to use the fire extinguisher. So that worked well. I did that intentionally because this gives me an opportunity to have another look at the actuating device and move the operating handle upwards. I'm looking for debris that may stop this actuating device from working. In particular, on vehicle fire extinguishers, you can get debris and stuff stuck in there, which stops the handle from working. All that looks pretty good. I also am looking that my maintenance record tag is still attached to the fire extinguisher, even with that pin being removed. So this can be attached to the extinguisher in a number of places. This is the best place on this extinguisher for it, and I have a little lead that's holding it in position, so that always remains with the fire extinguisher. This forms an important part of the record keeping system for fire extinguishers, and I can see that this one's out of date. So the 2017, it expired, and I will not remove this tag, but add another tag to it so it does form an ongoing history of the maintenance that's been done. Now, that means that I've got 3 years that this thing hasn't been inspected. Now, that's not my problem. I'm just going to inspect from this point onwards. I'm not going to complete any previous inspections on my tag because that would then fudge the records, so to speak. So I would put a new tag on that, and this is another thing in my mind thinking, well, I've already got to pressure test it, and that will indicate or start a new service period for me once I pressure test it and put a new label on it. The tag enables us to stamp the level of service that we've provided, either 1, 2 or 4, within a range of a month and a year. This particular tag also has a predated hydrostatic test or pressure test part. Not all tags have this, and it's not required, but it enables us to predate the 2010 pressure test down this section here. So it finishes in 2017 down here, which means the tag's out of date. We're going to need to use and put on a new tag, which is going to start from 2019, and we'll be stamping this tag along this line here in August 2019. Okay, so it's looking good so far. We need to now look at the last pressure test date. So a level 4, we're doing a level 2 inspection now, which is a yearly inspection. A level 4 inspection is required every 5 years on a fire extinguisher. So we need to know when it had its last level 4 inspection or level 4 test. Now, the level 4 or pressure test, as it's commonly called in the industry, must be indelibly marked on the fire extinguisher. So if it hasn't been pressure tested, we use the manufacture date as the last pressure test date. So we're looking for either the manufacture date or an indelible mark indicating when it was last pressure tested by a registered pressure testing station. So I'm looking for the indelible mark. On a CO2 fire extinguisher, it's normally up around the head of the fire extinguisher. However, on other types, you would normally find it around the skirt of the fire extinguisher. In this case, I can see an indelible mark here. It says 111, and normally there is a number in between the date, which would be the registered pressure testing station number. So it indicates that it was last pressure tested in the first month of the year 2011. Now, it's meant to be pressure tested every 5 years, so it's a little bit overdue. In fact, it's a lot overdue. It should have been pressure tested again in 2016. So this fire extinguisher fails the inspection. So I need to do one of two things. I need to either replace the fire extinguisher or take it to a registered filling station for pressure testing. Now, the standard says that we should put an out of service tag on the fire extinguisher. So I'd put an out of service tag on it and I would take it away. So in general, it depends on your relationship with your customer, but we would put an out of service tag on it primarily for my purposes so that I can track where the fire extinguisher is, and I would replace the fire extinguisher or give my customer a loaner and not leave the fire extinguisher place empty. So that concludes the inspection on the CO2 type of fire extinguisher. I'd just like to show you a couple of points that are relevant to other types of fire extinguishers. I just want to point out again that as far as signage of fire extinguishers is concerned, we have a location sign and we have a type sign. This extinguisher doesn't have a type sign, but it's not required by the standard that a fire extinguisher has a type sign. The benefit of the type sign is for the inspection person, so that if the extinguisher is not in place, we can see what should be there. So I just wanted to add to the checklist a little bit with different types of fire extinguishers. First of all, a powder type fire extinguisher indicated by a white band. This extinguisher has a gauge, and a part of the checklist requires us to check the gauge and make sure that the pressure the pressure is indicating full. There's a green mark in the middle of the gauge, and the indicator should be in the middle of the green gauge. Also, when we're inspecting powder type fire extinguishers, because there's a concentration of dry chemical powder in here, and it has a tendency to cake into a block, and we need to invert the fire extinguisher and make sure that we can feel the powder free flowing. And I can feel that shift of weight from one end of the fire extinguisher to the other, and that feels okay. On smaller type powder extinguishers that would be used for a vehicle, it's more difficult to feel that weight shift, so I normally give them a shake. And especially on vehicles where the vibration of the vehicle is likely to compact the powder further, sometimes we might need to hit it on the bottom with a rubber hammer before we can feel it starting to move. So I just wanted to finish off with one more point, and that is another type of fire extinguisher called a foam fire extinguisher. So there's an additional requirement for fire extinguishers that have chemicals as a part of their extinguishant. And the foam fire extinguisher, indicated by a blue band, is primarily for fighting fuel type fires. And it has a chemical that enables the water that's inside to foam up. And that chemical has a lifespan and needs to be replaced every year. So every level 2 service on a foam type fire extinguisher requires decanting and replacement of the contents. Water fire extinguishers don't have that requirement unless they have an additive. So an additive could be an antifreeze if it's in a cold environment, or it could be a water softening agent if it's in a high alkalinic type or hard water type environment. So water fire extinguishers with an additive need to be decanted and the contents changed every 12 months, and foam every 12 months has the same requirement. So now we'll complete our inspection on our CO2 fire extinguisher, and that'll conclude our video. Okay, so we'll now complete our inspection of our CO2 fire extinguisher, and I'm going to complete this by putting an out of service tag on this fire extinguisher. I'm going to remove it from service and more than likely get it pressure tested and probably use it within the company as a loaner. And I've discussed with the owner of the fire extinguisher and agreed that we will replace the fire extinguisher with a new fire extinguisher of exactly the same type. So I've completed the inspection and weighed it, and I've clearly indicated on my database that the fire extinguisher has been replaced. However, I'm going to use the same identification number on the fire extinguisher. So I mentioned earlier that a fire extinguisher must have an identification number on it. So I'm going to put our sticker back on it, which has the identification number on it. And this will essentially become exactly the same fire extinguisher as the other one, and my record will indicate that the extinguisher's been replaced. And it'll have the same ID number, so the history remains the same. So then it just leaves us to how we deal with the tag and what are we going to do. So I'm looking at the manufacture date of the fire extinguisher, which, remember, that starts our service cycle. And the manufacture date on this extinguisher is 07/2018. So that's a bit of a problem for me, because I'm now already 2 years into my service life of the fire extinguisher, which means it only has another 3 years left. So just be mindful of that when you're buying fire extinguishers. They have a service life of 5 years before they need to be pressure tested. So what I do is I get my numbered punch and I'm going to mark on the tag a level 4 service in the 7th month 2018. So this tag starts in 2018, so it makes it easy for me to go to July. Now when you're doing this, try and keep the number vertical so it's easy to read. And just double check that you're doing 7th month is July and you're in the right box. And I'm stamping my level 4 service in the month of July. I'm then going to go to a level 1 service, which would be my 6 monthly service. And I'm going to stamp a level 1 in the 8th month of 2020. And that is a true indication of how this extinguisher came into service. 6 months from now, I'll stamp a level 2. So that concludes our routine maintenance, inspection and testing of fire extinguishers.